The first thing I need you to do for me, just for archiving purposes, is to say and spell your full name for me.
Okay.
Okay, anytime you're ready.
My name is Sister Eileen Marie Flanagan, also known as Catherine Mary Flanagan. That's my legal name. Okay. So just in case there's somebody who doesn't know me.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this while we're on the subject of your name. How did you choose your name?
When I first entered, we had to give up our name, and because it was like leaving the world. And so as a result of that, we got a choice of 3 names. And I had a sister by the name of Helen, and I wanted to have Helen Marie. So, but we already had a Helen Marie. So they took Eileen, which is the Gaelic for Helen, and that's how I got Eileen Marie. That's the history of that name. And my legal name is Catherine Mary. And because I was born on the 4th of December, my mother had great devotion to Mary, the Blessed Mother, and her feast day was going to be on the 8th of December. So that was the closest to the Catherine Labouré. That was the feast that my mother took my name for, Catherine. So that's it.
That's very good. Okay, so tell me about you as a child. What kind of little girl were you?
Oh.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I belong to a family of 10 children, 2 wonderful parents, very much steeped in the faith. I grew up in Dublin, Ireland. I happen to be very special because I was born premature, 2 months premature. And my mother didn't tell me this until after I was professed nun, that when I was born, there was a sister there helping to deliver me, and she told my mother that I would be a nun one of these days. Well, my mother wouldn't tell me that because she didn't want to put that obligation on me, or thinking I have to go to be a nun. And so, as a result, I didn't hear it until years later. Now, I was the child, there were 3 older than I, and then there were 6 younger. And one of them was a twin, and she died when she was 6 weeks old. So we really grew up with 9 children. And there were 6 girls and 4 boys. So as a child, I was very slow in developing. I didn't walk until I was almost 2, so my brother that was born after me walked ahead of me. And there was always this great competition because he got everything before I did. However, I outsmarted him. I got ahead of him eventually. And I didn't, because of being premature, I guess, and being very frail, I didn't have too many activities. I wasn't allowed to do a lot of things. However, I was very, very close to my mother. And she taught me a lot of things. And my sisters also were, always looking out for me. So my oldest sister, Esther, will say that I was spoiled, even to this day. She's here in the convent. So, but I used to do a great deal of imagination. I could look at the clouds and see different things. My other sister Helen and I were very close, and we would make up stories and make up songs. We grew up in the time of the war. We did not have radio. We did not have television. We had gas lighting throughout the whole house and gas fires because my father worked for the gas company. So we were the only house in the whole village, as you might say, that had light when the storms came. Electricity didn't really come into our village or our town until, many years later. It was like looking back now, it was like living in the 1800s. if a car came up our road, it was, wow, something great to be seen. We'd all run out to see where it was going. We mainly travelled most people travelled by horse and buggy. And we lived near a race course, which I thought was a wonderful thing. And all the people that came for the races came up in these like stage coaches. But we were never allowed to go out of the garden. We could look out over the railing at all of them, but there was no going down the steps and out onto the road. And the horse and buggies were all lined up, and it was a wonderful time to be living at that time. We didn't know any different. But I can tell you a story about one of my sisters. She got out, Helen, and she got into one of the carriages. There was like, the stage coach thing. And didn't the horse take off? And here she is riding past our house in the carriage. And so my father, of course, had to go after her. Somebody stopped her, and she got into a lot of trouble. But that was a memory that I have of those times. We lived also in an area where we had Phoenix Park, which is the second biggest park in the world. London Park, I think, I forget now how many acres are in it, but it's like how many inches are in a mile, something like that, they said. But this Phoenix Park was where our school was. It was a national school. It was called Phoenix Park National School. But I didn't start school there. I went to the Dominican school. And I was only there for, I think, 1 year, 2 years. And then I was taken out of that school and put into the Phoenix Park National School. Mainly, I think it was because times were very hard at the time, rations and so forth. And the government was giving lunches in the national school, so my mother, that wasn't the only reason she took us out, but other reasons. But we went there, and I missed the convent school. And I was about to make my first Holy Communion when we were taken out of the convent school. So being put into the National Catholic School, I had to go before the parish priest to see if I could make my first Holy Communion. And so I got really interrogated, I would say, on the catechism. Well, I passed, and I was able to make my first Holy Communion, but our parish church was so far away, you'd have to get 2 buses or walk at least an hour to the church. So this little town, this little village, went to the chapel of the Daughters of Charity. And so that's where I made my first Holy Communion. Now, I had no idea about being a nun or anything like that. I didn't have any real encounters with nuns. However, there were nuns there, and they were up in the choir, and the choir loft looked so very high for me. But when they would sing, it was just like angels. It was so beautiful. But they also had a home there for children who were disabled and very badly disabled from practically over the whole country, I think even from Europe. And I was a little nervous going there because I didn't understand children who were disabled. But eventually I got used to going, and I made friends with some of them there, the sisters there. One of them was named Catherine, and I thought, well, I'm called after that Catherine because it was a daughter of charity that I was called after, Catherine Labouré. And so I kind of enjoyed myself there. However, as time went on, my oldest sister, who was going to be coming to see you, she wanted to be a nun. And she would wear a towel around her head and strut around the room that she's going to be a nun. And I had no intention of ever being a nun. And as I grew up, and myself and my other sister Helen, who was very close to me, we're like twins almost, she and I were going to get married, but we were going to find 2 brothers who we could marry. And we were going to have large families each. And we would have a close by near where we could live near each other. That was our dream. And then my sister decided, Helen, not Esther, the oldest one, decided she wanted to be a nun. And through all I'll let her tell her story on that. However, the sisters came to our house from Florida, and myself and my sister made sure we weren't there because we did not want to be nuns and we weren't going to be talked into it. Now, we were only about 12 or 13 at that time. But when my mother inquired, where were you? We said we didn't want to meet them because we didn't want to be nuns. So the vocation for me didn't come like from early childhood. It happened that when I got into my teens, I went to work early and I helped. My cousin had a hotel and I was able to babysit for her children, take them down onto the beach, which we call the seaside because it's the Irish Sea. And I helped to clean rooms and helped to do all kinds of things. And it happened one day, I was cleaning, looking in the mirror at myself, cleaning. And I was saying, why should I work for her? I could work for God. That was the way it just came. Why? By this time now, my sister had already entered the Sisters of St. Joseph. And I thought, maybe I'll write to her and find out what the sisterhood is like. So I wrote to her, and I didn't get an answer back. Instead, I got two sisters come to visit me. They happened to be in Ireland, and they found out I was inquiring about this, and I was still at the hotel about 20 miles away from home, and they came to visit me. Well, it was a surprise. And those two sisters, one of them is still living today, Sister Thomas Joseph, and Mother Anna Joseph. Both of them came, and they talked to me and so forth. Well, my mother, in the meantime, she was recuperating from a major surgery, and she was down with a friend in Wicklow, that's another county. And when she heard about me wanting to be a nun, she came all the way out to where I was working, and she said, do you think you could enter the convent without my permission? Now, I have to tell you, she was not really in favor of my sister entering or me entering, whatever the reason being, whether she had not so good experience or what. But I think what it was, she was hoping she'd have grandchildren, because my brother went into the seminary, the second one went into the convent, the third one went off nursing, and here's the fourth one wanting to go into the convent. And she says, Tommy, what if we had stopped at 4, have no more children? We wouldn't have any grandchildren, because Helen had not intended to even marry, I guess. However, God has the plan. And my mother said, okay. My father said, fine. And I pursued getting ready to go to Florida. And I found somebody else that was going, Maura McGuire, and the two of us took off for the convent. And that's the story. Coming over on the plane was another whole thing. We're sitting there, and there were two guys in back of us. And of course, they were interested in the two ladies in front. And I was playing up to them, not saying anything, but being, And we were having a lot of fun. And Maura then sold them. Oh, no, they said, where are you going? We said, going to Florida. Florida, that's great. My gosh. They said, who do you have in Florida? Because you have to be claimed. Oh, I said, I have a sister in Florida. Didn't tell them she was a nun. What do you think? Maura came out, we're going to be nuns. Well, with that, the two guys just stopped. And I said, Maura, why are you telling him that? He said, well, she said, because when we get off the plane, and they get off the plane, they're going to see us with 2 nuns. And we better tell them before we arrive. So that was all right. So, but again, that was part and parcel of the plan. Then we went to the Taft Hotel in New York because we had to stay overnight. And I had an experience there that really I didn't know what to do. We were dressed now as postulants, which reminded me like of pilgrims because we had the white collar and the cuffs and the veil and all of that. And Maura Maguire's aunt was going to come and take us out to see New York. And when she saw us dressed in this way, she said, no way, she's going to take us out. So then we were coming out of the elevator with the 2 nuns, and there was this man, and he had a little dog, and the dog started yapping. And what happened? I thought, oh, I love animals, this little dog. And of course, I was ready to go pet him. But the man was very arrogant, and he didn't apparently like nuns. And he actually spat on Mother Anna Maria. And I was so shocked because I'd come from a country where it was, this was a privilege to be with a nun, and I didn't know what I was getting into. But I said, should I turn around and go home or what? But I didn't. God had plans for me. And indeed, for the rest of my life in the convent, it wasn't easy. I had my times of doubts. In fact, I was almost ready to go home. And somehow or other, God turned me around and said, no. I had a great deal of prayer going up for me, and I didn't go home. Now, that is a story that I believe is an answer to prayer. My mother was delighted that I was coming home. However, she, being very prayerful, wanted to know what the will of God was for me and that I wouldn't make a mistake in coming home. And her prayers were answered because I got a very special grace to be able to say, no, I believe I am to be in the convent. Well, convent life then had its ups and downs, and actually I was jealous somewhat of people who thought, wow, this is really my calling, this is my calling. I could never really feel that deep down, and I had to work at, saying, am I really meant for the convent? But I think it made me more appreciative of the calling because it wasn't something that it was just, a nice thing to do. It was really a sacrifice. And it was, I would say, having to really probe and know, is it for me? What is God really calling me to? But every time that anything like that came up, there was always answers. And it still happens today. Whenever I have any big question or where I think maybe this is not what God really wants, there's something in me that I discern. It's what we call discernment. And it's from the Ignatian exercises. The Jesuits were very good. And by the way, I got trained in that. I'll tell you about that. And as I now look back and see God's plan was really fulfilled. But it was always not with great certainty and that you're really grounded in this. It was never that. It was, you must keep on the right road, and you must pray, and you must keep vigilant. And the word vigilant was very important because it can easily move into areas of, where you can get lost in that. And I think that goes for every life. Married people have to work on marriage, and priests and brothers have to work. And we don't talk too much about the work that we have to go through in our religious life. But it is the test, and it brings you much closer in the intimacy with God. And it has a purpose, and to me, the purpose is to have what we call, like in marriage, if you don't have communication and openness, it's not going to last. But if you don't have communication and openness in your spiritual life, it's not going to last. You might walk around and have everything in place, but deep down, what is in the heart and what is in the mind, and how are you developing spiritually? And so, with that in mind, God called me to a very special ministry. I was a teacher, I was principal of a school, and I was a teacher, but I wasn't satisfied. There was something I said, well, other people can do this. And again, I was beginning to get turned round. And through a deep depression and search, and having to spend some time in like a sabbatical, which was about 6 weeks, I went to the Ignatian House in Atlanta. And there I had what I call a radical conversion. And it was very, very deep. In fact, it was so radical that it almost changed my appearance. I was now grounded in a conviction of something that I needed to do. And that was, I was to become a woman of prayer, not of math and science and so forth. And so a community listened to me. And Sister Thomas Joseph was the Reverend Mother at the time and said, okay, I can't touch this with a 10-foot pole. And so finally I found a program, Creighton University, and they were opening up for the first time. Father Sheets, who became Bishop Sheets, had a program for Christian spirituality. And in Christian spirituality, it was like an umbrella with many spokes. And so they discerned with you, the professors there, as to what program you could go into, whether it would be pastoral or would be retreat work or whatever. So they said I would be probably very good in retreat work. So I was the first in our community to go into retreat work. That was not one of our ministries. And God just opened up the way. I opened up a house of prayer in Mandarin. It was only a small home, and I was there for 25 years. And I had spiritual direction. I still do that today. I gave retreats. I gave retreats at Marywood, and they weren't just, they were like men's clubs. From Fernandina, had a weekend retreat with them. Different kinds of retreats, but all based on the one thing, and that is the search within for a deeper relationship with God in your life. And every walk of life needs to know how to move into that direction. So the real question is, what is God doing in your life? And why are you sitting there listening to me? What is God doing in your life? And so it is a beautiful, beautiful calling. While I was in that ministry also, I was called to be the vicar for the religious for the diocese when Bishop Snyder first came in. And it so happened we were without a bishop for a while. I went to Ireland to meet the Holy Father, Pope. Now stuck.
That's okay.
Saint John Paul. He was in Ireland. I met him, and my father, being a lamplighter in the Phoenix Park, had access to somebody who was the chauffeur of the Pope. So he said, if you write a letter to the Pope, he'll get it. So I wrote a letter welcoming him to Ireland and telling him that we were all praying for a new bishop in St. Augustine. And I got a response back, naturally, but not from the Holy Father, but from his secretary. I still have that letter. And when Bishop Snyder was elected, and then he came to Florida, somebody must have told him that story. But he came to me now, he says, I'll get you back. He said, I heard that you told the Pope there was no bishop down here. And sure enough. Well, what happened then was we needed to have a vicar for the religious. That's like a secretary to the bishop for all the religious men and women in the diocese. And so there was a search, and lo, guess who was voted in was myself. I had no idea what was going to happen. I didn't even know computer work. However, God has a plan. I think that's my famous song, God Has a Plan. But it is, I worked there or ministered there for 13 years. And it was very, very rewarding. But I still kept the house of prayer. And I still did the spiritual direction. And then, where am I today? And what is happening? Well, we had to close the house of prayer because we're going to sell that land. So I came into St. Augustine. And I fell into bad health while I was here. Well, it was before that, and so I had to give up being over at the villa and came over. So I asked to go into Lourdes retirement home, not to retire, but to work and to help. Because my sister was the administrator there, and I used to go in there often, and I loved the sisters there. Well, I advanced from helping there to becoming administrator for 2 years, and that's not my bag at all. No. I like to be at grassroots level. And so they really put me at grassroots level. They asked, would you like to be in the kitchen? So I became the food manager for I don't know how many years, and I loved it there. And then just this year, I had another major setback in health. I had to have major surgery, and I came out of it very well. However, the Reverend Mother, Sister Jane, decided that the kitchen was a little bit too heavy for me. Would I now step out and let others take over? And that wasn't easy. However, again, God worked. Whenever there is a cross, or whenever there is a coming like this, I always have to take a look at, what is God really trying to tell me? Not what is Sister Jane trying to tell me, but out of this, what is God really trying to tell me? Well, Sister Jane came up with something, and I didn't want to really take the responsibility. However, I said I would help, and that was the spiritual welfare and development of our sisters at Lourdes. And I said yes. Well, when I said yes, it was like grudgingly, how am I going to do this? Because back in the back of my mind, a prophet is not accepted in his own hometown. Now, will a sister be accepted in her own convent, being this? So I had to pray. And I was quickly reminded again, as Jesus himself reminds me all the time, it's not you that's doing it, it's me. And the words that come, remember, St. Paul says, I live, it's not I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. And it is in him that we live and move and have our being. And if I believe this with all my heart, that he lives in me, He surrounds me. It's like it's the ancient, not Gaelic, yeah, the Gaelic, I guess it is, no, Celtic spirituality. That, God just is not existing in your soul, but you're insisting on Him, existing in Him. And it made sense to me then to think, well, I really have nothing except what God gives me to give. And whatever He gives me to give, I try to follow. And in trying to follow that, miracles happen. Because I can sit back, and if people say, well, how do you do that? You don't. He does it. And I'll give you just one example of that in my life. I was called on to give a day of retreat at one of our parishes. And I tried to get everything ready. Oh, I'm just going to make a really good deal of this. Got it all set. And what happened? I get over there. It's a crossover on the beaches. And I took the wrong folder. I don't have my retreat. I don't have time to go back and get it. Now there's about 60 people waiting. What am I going to do? So I said to the leader, I said, do you mind if I go into the church for a minute? And I went before the Blessed Sacrament. I said, what are you doing to me? And the answer came, you're not doing this, I am. Step aside.
Hold on 1 second. Hold that thought. We've got a battery that just failed. Sorry.
I'm doing a lot of talking, right?
That's right. I asked you one question.
Yeah. But it's kind of, it's a story.
Right near that pocket. Should be another one in there.
I thought I had a spare one already. I guess I did.
Okay. And I'm not going hoarse.
You're doing good. Holy Spirit must be moving around, huh?
Now, where was I?
Your phone rang, by the way.
Okay. Sorry.
You were talking about the retreat, and God told you that
Yeah.
get out of the way. The last
Get
thing
out of
you
the way.
said, and you probably need to go back just a little bit so that, in case you missed any of that.
Yeah.
So you went into the chapel.
Yes.
Okay.
I was in the chapel. And when I asked that question, I got the answer. You move out of the way, I will do it. You're only my mouthpiece. So I went there, no notes, and in the entire day went magnificently. It was one of the best retreats I think I had ever given because I was out of the way. And it is amazing. It's very hard to do that in one way, but what it takes is really to trust. And I was really backed up against a wall. I just couldn't say no. So I had to do and ride the waves. And I didn't drown. I got through it all right. And it's amazing because after that, my morning prayer is, when I get out of bed, before I just put my feet on the ground, is, Lord, help me not get in your way of what you want to do in and through and with me today. And at night, when I come to nighttime, it's how did we do today, not how did I do. And that's my life. That's where I believe that God is truly present with me and that I have been more than blessed. And that's what I call vocation. The vocation to the religious life in one of my big times of deciding whether I should come or should go in religious life. And the answer that came at one point in the time of sabbatical, where I had that radical conversion, it was very, very plain to me that God created me for a purpose. And I was brought to under a deeper understanding of what the vowed life was, what poverty, chastity, and obedience was about. And you can read it all in books, and you can recite it all, but the reality of it is that you have to be really taught by the Holy Spirit deep down in that commitment, and that you're not making those vows in the convent to the people around you. You're making them to God. And so, with the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, now that's how we used to say it, but now they say chastity, poverty, and obedience, because chastity is the vow of love, where you give your love to God and God's love pours through you, that it does not interfere with the love of being married, in other words, giving up. And of course, we always thought of it, oh gosh, I have to be chaste and I have to be pure but if you concentrate on that love, that's where chastity comes in. And then poverty. Poverty is not going round in rags. Poverty is not something that, you have to do without things. It's simplicity. And it really is. My mother grew up as a Franciscan Third Order, my father, and she used to say this. She'd say, we thank God in time of plenty, and we thank God in time of scarcity. But for poverty, the vow of poverty is really the detachment. Actually, detachment from persons, places, and things. And you can use all of them, but to be so detached, it means if you are not detached from them, they become idols. And that's for everybody, but especially for the religious life, for the one who's called to the consecrated life. And this is what I learned in my time of conversion. And then obedience. Obedience was the most difficult one, because it is really seeking the will of God. And to be obedient as Jesus was. He was obedient even unto death. And so the obedience is, are you willing to obey your superiors? Are you willing to obey the church? But there's a clause in there. And that clause is that it has to be part on their will of God for them. Like when Sister Jane asks me to do something, I have to do the discernment before I can just be a yes person. It doesn't mean being just yes and doing. That's more like a child. But the mature part of it is that together you discern the will of God in it. And how do we know what the will of God is? And that's a huge question. I remember giving a retreat on that one time, and it was difficult. But God's will is wills also for our contentment and for our happiness and for our peace. And if you're not at peace with something and you're not happy doing it, and you're not into, really doing it, if you're only doing it for the ego and to build up yourself, then that's not really fulfilling the will of God. So the will of God can be simple enough if you know how to really pray and seek and be aware of the movements of the Holy Spirit within you. Now I'm getting into a whole lot of the theology part of this, but it's a passion of mine to be able to help people in this. And that's what spiritual direction is really about. Spiritual direction is companioning a person on their spiritual journey. And always asking that question, where is God in this? And how is God in the forefront? Because we as human beings if we don't keep God before us, we have false gods. And false gods are so common that that's the first commandment. You shall not have false gods before you. And so that's part of who I am and what I'm doing here today. And I'm still doing spiritual direction. And I love every minute of my ministry.